One of my first classes was an Intro to Religious Studies. It was a survey course taught by a man named, oh boy, I'm forgetting his name. He was a kook, that I remember. And he introduced us to, about halfway through the course, he introduced us to a little blue book, I and Thou by Martin Buber. And it blew my mind. I was a fairly strict atheist at the time. Still am if I'm in a room of theists. If I'm in a room of atheists, I'm a theist. So, but I was really attracted to religion and religious phenomena and religious experience, and hadn't found any sort of vocabulary that allowed me to discover what that was all about that wasn't married to the mythology of a particular tradition. So I was always on the outside looking in. But I and Thou gave me a way in. It's reductionist in its way. And I'm a fool because I need philosophy to legitimate experience and poetry to express experience, and I and Thou does both. And I would like to read the beginning of it to you. Apologies, it's a little lengthy. And I've actually adjusted some of the language since it was written in German and translated when patriarchy was the default. Ken was the professor's name. To people, the world is twofold, in accordance with their twofold attitude. The attitude of a human is twofold, in accordance with the twofold nature of the primary words which a human speaks. The primary words are not isolated words, but combined words. The one primary word is the combination I, thou. The other primary word is the combination I, it, wherein without change in the primary word, one of the words he and she can replace it. Hence, the I of a person is also twofold. For the I of the primary word I, thou is a different I from that of the primary word I, it. Primary words do not signify things, but they intimate relations. Primary words do not describe something that might exist independently of them, but being spoken, they bring about existence. Primary words are spoken from the being. If thou is said, the I of the I combination, I, thou, is said along with it. And if it is said, the I combination of I, it is said along with it. The primary word I, thou can only be spoken with the whole being. The primary word I, it can never be spoken with the whole being. And then we had a whole semester to discuss what that meant. And we have 15 more minutes. So what does it mean? It means that reality is made up of relationships. Your reality is your relationships. Your reality is not determined by your relationships, as though your relationships were just part of your reality, which determines the rest of it. No, reality is relation. And when you boil it all down, muses Buber, relation separates into two modes, which he calls primary words, but really are pre-linguistic. I-it is mundane engagement. I-thou is a holy or divine or cosmic, or words fail, so ineffable. I-thou is a holy engagement, a religious experience. So Buber and I, over time, have differed on some of the finer points of what he had to say, but his thinking launched me on a trajectory that has never left his orbit. Philosophers can quibble over the minutiae of specific vocabulary, but we are not philosophers. Most of us are not philosophers. We stir their pure grain thinking into the tonic of our life to make it digestible. So we do not need philosophers or mystics to get that our reality is the quality of our relationships. Our reality is how we engage whatever we come upon or come up against. Our reality is how we relate. Our reality is our relationships, our connection. So I want to derivate from Buber, which is a word my spell check didn't recognize, but it made perfect sense to me. I want to be derivative of Buber, who holds that the I-thou relation is a mutual event, that all parties involved are all I-thouing, and that indeed there really is no separation between the parties. It's all just one big I-thou hug of inseparable holiness. And when the I-it is going on, it's the same. One big squished together ball of dried up Play-Doh of different colors. It's all brittle and no longer fun. And that actually may be. I find Buber's division of the world into these two fundamental attitudes to be helpful, but not quite comprehensive, in the sense that I don't think that we're binary. I don't think that it's so black or white. It makes more sense to me to think of I-thou and I-it as poles on a continuum. At one end is utter objectification, absolute I-itness, and at the other end is that religious experience of dissolving into everything, or God, or absolute love, the cosmic expansion of identity. So for me, it's a pole. And this is a very attractive idea, right? And Buber notes that the holy event, this part way over here, is dependent on grace. So, grace. My thinking about grace is derived from another theologian, Lou Holtz, who was Notre Dame's football coach for a while. And when asked about, they won the game, they got lucky on that fumble, he said, no, there's no such thing as luck, there's only being prepared for opportunity. And that's more or less my thinking about grace. I think ritual, for instance, prepares us for grace, right? But grace can then, if our ritual is designed to put us into an ecstatic state, we can do everything right and still not hit the ecstatic state. The ecstatic state comes about by virtue of an innumerable amount of other factors and contingencies, some of which took place before you were born and have to do with your birth. So we do not manufacture grace, but we can prepare ourselves to recognize it and engage in it when it happens. And that is what I imagine that we are doing here every Sunday and throughout the week in all of our activities related to this community. Did you know that? You're like, I had no idea. I thought I was just singing carols and hanging Christmas tree lights. Well, believe it or not, by virtue of it being an activity of this intentional religious community, you were and we are preparing ourselves to enter into ITHOW, to experience reality as a religious experience. And if I, thou, and I, it are poles, they may also be pole stars and guide us. I left a little bit early, so I don't know if anybody did experience the religious and holy while they were hanging Christmas tree lights. But hanging Christmas tree lights was a step on the pole star toward ITHOW because you were engaged in intentional religious community. And so that is part of preparation. Other ways that we prepare, the first way that we prepare simply is by drawing attention to how we wish to be in relationship. Be aware of that. I think that a preparation of just awareness is also invitational to, it calls to us. Our preparation makes waves. The way we prepare to enter into relationship affects how we enter into relationship. The way we relate affects the relationship, affects reality. Now, I would say affects and not dominates, so it's not all I, thou, or I, it. But for example, you may encounter an abrupt person. You may bring all your compassion into that moment. And that will change the moment. It probably won't overwhelm the moment. It probably won't turn an abrupt person into a patient person in that moment. But it will affect the moment. And your part will feel much better. And this means your reality will feel much better. For in that other person might be the angel of a lesson or an opportunity to be your best self, to practice welcome, and so to step toward salvation. And after enough practice, even these encounters may shift, may appear as invitations, may invite you into the divine spark of another. Even as you're interacting with an abrupt person, you may find your way into a radical welcome, wherein you do experience I, thou. It's not that I, thou happens just because you are preparing to engage the world as I, thou, but rather it is that I, thou is nearly impossible without your preparation. You cannot bring it about because of intention, but without intention, it will not come about. The truth is that there is nothing in this world that is actually a stranger to us. For the moment we enter into relationship with an unknown, we become conspirators and partners with that reality. I, it, I, thou. You approaching relationship with an attitude of I, thou will affect your experience and will affect that shared space of the relationship. And by the same token, you can and probably do and often must treat those even closest to you who you love with an attitude of I, it. Sometimes that is necessary. There is a bumper sticker that you might recall that reads, "Don't I, thou, and drive." Right? We don't want you having an out-of-body experience on the I-10. The point is this. reality as we experience it is neither subjective nor objective. It is neither only perception nor physical. It is intersubjective. It is between. It is mutually manifested, influenced by our attention, not so much in its material, but in its character and quality. And we could further distill Buber's thinking, and this is going to make Buber roll in his grave to hear me say it, but I think these are pole stars of reality, and they orient us to enter into relationship with intention, and I can extrapolate, you hairy old goat. Sorry, I was talking to Buber there. And the distillation is this, because you got to start somewhere, right? So if you want the world and your life to be more whatever, bring more whatever to it. If you want more love, bring more love. If you want to be heard more, listen more. If you want more forgiveness, bring more forgiveness. If you want more beauty, open your eyes wider. If you want more religious experiences, bring more patience. If you want more I, thou, if you want more I, thou, if you want I, thou, if you, I, thou. So last week I spoke about salvation. I've mentioned it already today. And I've done it before this, and I'll certainly do it again. Some of you may be totally comfortable with that concept. Others may have a harder time with it. It may harken back to prior religious episodes you'd rather leave in the past. Or it just may sound totally foreign. A lot of folks never went to church before they came here. But, in fact, it is a founding distinction of our faith, and we eschew it at our own peril. So let's welcome our own history into our hearts. It is, after all, how we got here. You see, the universalist strand of our faith was founded in a Christian context, wherein one of the great debates concerned the salvation of the soul. Whether or not a person would be brought to the bosom of God after that person perished from this earth. So by the time that our iteration of universalism emerged, the prevailing religious thought in America and Northern Europe was Calvinist. It held that a select few souls were chosen by God, and there was nothing anyone could really do about it. You could certainly damn yourself with your actions, or at least in some versions of this theology you could, but you could not really save yourself. It was predetermined, predestined. In this framework, then, what you were left with was faith. So faith over works. Now, the Universalists had a different idea. Prominent among them was a man named Jose Ballou. He was a Boston Universalist. He read the Bible and wondered provocatively, why would a loving God create beings in order to damn them to hell for eternity? Ballou said that a loving God would eventually bring everyone back home. That is what a loving God would do. He believed in a loving God, and so he believed that everyone was saved. Everyone was saved. The Calvinists were apoplectic. They lost their minds, and out of that, Harvard Divinity School was born, believe it or not. And it was ours. We won. It was one of the few times we won. We won twice. Until now. We're winning. We're winning. So this universalist theological understanding had two far-reaching effects. One, if everyone was saved, salvation in the afterlife was no longer a thing that you necessarily had to strive for. This in turn meant that what was up to us was how we acted in this life, how we affected this life, not how we affected our next life, how we affected this life. So afterlife de-emphasized, present life prioritized, or afterlife a given, so present life worth striving to improve. Thus, relative to the Calvinists, we have a developing emphasis on behavior more than faith. Faith was important, but faith was demonstrated by behavior. And this notion evolved over time, even influencing their cousins, the Unitarians, who developed the notion of salvation by character, which is not necessarily universalist, mind you, but certainly influenced by it. And after a while, the notion of the afterlife just became less and less important. And salvation became something that we could achieve now on this earth in this life for each other. And at the time when this conviction took hold, when someone was speaking about salvation in this life, they were talking about justice and peace. Economic, medical, racial, international, sexual, chemical justice and peace. Social harmony was salvation. The kingdom of God and the beloved community. That's the first implication of universal salvation. Salvation as social system, salvation as beloved community. The other implication of Ballou's radical universalism was that if everyone was created by a loving God to eventually be reunited with a loving God, then everyone was created with inherent worth and dignity of the divine within them. So that should sound familiar. We promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person as our first principle. That comes straight from our Universalist forebears. And it is related to the concept of salvation. Now, with that being said, I would like to highlight two things. First, as I have said, we are a tradition whose cornerstone is revision. So social, salvation, and inherent worth and dignity are not stopping points. They are iterations of the original. They are iterations of universal salvation. And we are still evolving and revising, and in our evolution and revision, I believe it is time for us to sit with two more iterations of universal salvation. One, that salvation is indeed a psychological, or perhaps more comprehensively, a spiritual event. Salvation is the freedom from fear. And its manifestation is not the kind where once you have it, you've got it for all eternity, but rather that salvation is felt in moments, perhaps, I would like to believe, in moments of greater duration as we become more adept. So salvation in this life, yes, but without losing our inspiration to strive for social salvation, which is of inestimable value, I want to reorient us to the idea that spiritual salvation is a real possibility. And, as we spoke about last week, one path to that spiritual salvation is to welcome all things. And this leads me to the second iteration of universal salvation that I would like us to welcome. That we proclaim the inherent dignity and worth of all people means all people. Each and every person. The person next to you, behind you. Even the ones that piss you off. The ones that irritate you. That we promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person does not mean that we are entitled to simmer in the stew of our own magnanimous glory. It is not something that we should congratulate ourselves for. Rather, let us shift our emphasis from the notion that we have inherent worth and dignity, and from the notion that some category of the oppressed has inherent worth and dignity, and start shifting our focus to the notion that the actual people in our lives, the others that we come up against every day, whether we know them by name or not, they possess inherent worth and dignity, and we are invited to engage them as such. Let it be our call more than our affirmation. Let us, rather than assume our own inherent worth and dignity, assume the inherent worth and dignity of the other and allow ourselves to be called into, rather than assume our own. For everyone here, and indeed everyone you meet, is a full-bodied being, an iteration of all being, an iteration of even yourself, just as you are an iteration of the same and an iteration of them, interconnected, mutually arising, and pushing that concept to its end, timeless. And so this means that there are no strangers. For the root of all our dignity and worth, the root of all of our dignity and worth, it's the same root. Now, whether you call that consciousness, life, God, or interconnected nature, it is the same root. Truly, there are only thous. We prepare for that with our welcome. Welcome is I, thou. Welcome is salvation.